that Yilmaz and Rudolf have spoken a couple of times the last few days about the nature of the exhibition, its sort of concept, its structure, so I won't do too much of that. Essentially, the show is a selection of pictures made since the mid-90s, and the selection was made based on the idea that at that time I began to be able to work in more than one kind of photographic process. Because up until the mid-90s I was making only the light boxes that you see up on the top floor. And after that I began to be able to make other kinds of photographic prints, the color ones, the black and white ones that you see. So it's not a very dramatic notion or a very dramatic idea of an artistic development, since I'm really making the same pictures with different final results, different kind of prints. But for me it represented an extension of my relationship to photography, which I think for an artist is always a very physical one. Your relationship to the art form is physical in that it's determined by what you can make, what you can actually make. So I thought maybe it would be most useful, I can try and give you sort of a view of how I see my relationship to photography. And I'm not going to speak in relation to images directly. But what we've arranged is that if I start talking about some certain picture that's in the show, we're going to put the image up there. But because I don't know which picture I'm going to talk about first, and we don't want to have a sequence of pictures on the screen all the time. I think that in the 70s and 80s, a lot of people my age encountered photography in a kind of new and specific and a sort of a new way. Particularly in the 60s, if you think about what art photography or photography as art was generally thought to be, you will probably think of black and white documentary photography printed at the size that is usually compatible with being seen in a publication of some kind. That was what the art of photography looked like in the mid-60s and even really into the mid-70s, and of course it looked like that in the mid-20s as well. And that kind of art photography, that kind of photography as art, to my mind then, and still today, was essentially perfect. There's really nothing that can be said against it on any critical level. The idea of the photographer going out into the world like Cartier-Bresson exemplified, and without any help or assistance, without any stagecraft, without anything to capture something as it happened and somehow transform that capture into a picture of the kind of quality that we've gotten used to from our experience of the other arts, like painting, for example. To be able to do that with a little camera, without any other equipment or help, is a kind of magical artistic act. And those kind of photographs are the ones that represent photography in probably its purest form. And when I was quite young, I encountered that photography in the great books by Walker Evans, particularly Walker Evans and Robert Frank in the 50s, late 50s and the 60s. And like most people who get interested in photography, it's pretty obvious the kind of accomplishment that those two books represent. So interestingly enough, in the 70s, when people my age began to get into photography from various different directions, interestingly enough, there was no sense of opposing that kind of photography, no sense that there was anything wrong with it, no sense that anything was lacking or any of that, you know? That wasn't a feeling. But Walker Evans and people of his era didn't get the chance to be artists in the free way that I got the chance to be an artist. I never had to work for a magazine. I never took an assignment from an editor. I never had a deadline. I never had to make a bunch of photographs I didn't like and hand them over to be published and try and get one or two good ones out of it on the side. I never had the problems that Bill Brand had, that Evans had, that Robert Frank had, that everybody had, who worked in the so-called photo image industry and tried to be artists on the side. You know, that's how it was for those photographers in that era. Something else we forget about the photographers of that era is that they made almost no money from their work. And there was no editions, they didn't have galleries, they didn't have all the things that we have now. They struggled to make photography into something under fairly adverse conditions, which are, you know, now sort of historical conditions. But people of my generation encountered photography as just another possible art medium, because of the fact that it had developed to the point, just to the point, where it was beginning to be accepted widely that photography was a complex art form just like all the others, and that the old debates about whether photography was art were kind of coming to an end right about that time. And so I entered photography in a completely free way. I never had to undergo any of those issues. And so it was easy for me, in a way, to have a little bit of a detached and in some ways partly critical attitude toward it. And the things that bothered me about the perfect photographs of Walker Evans or Robert Frank, a few things did bother me about them, or at least left me wondering. One was that they were kind of small. As pictures, they seemed kind of small. I had grown up as a painter, had been to museums, and really have always loved and learned a lot from painting. And I think our culture has learned a lot from painting. I think our culture, let's say Western culture that we're part of, has really learned to see through painting, learned to see the world through painting, and I think that's what happened to me. They were small because they seemed to have been made to be published in, as I said, to be published in magazines and newspapers and things, and there was no need for prints to be larger. But I always thought that prints could be larger, and I thought that the classic notion of photography was somehow there was a potential energy in there that hadn't been yet released. There was something about the medium of photography that hadn't really been released yet, and that had to do with its size. Of course, we were seeing bigger photographs in the 50s and 60s and so on in publicity and advertising on billboards and so on, and that was also a hint that there was technical or visual energy inside photography that hadn't been released. And the second aspect, of course, and this was part of the big debate of the 70s, more the 70s than the 60s, was color. Because in the old orthodoxy of art photography, one didn't work in color. That was just somehow became one of those unquestioned orthodoxies at the time. And people who were interested in the arts, the visual arts, from a view not constrained by the orthodoxy of photography, would wonder about that. What's the problem with color? So I think that was typical of finding photography too small, too monochrome, and yet at the same time deeply perfected. And so as a young artist, I had to encounter both this feeling of the perfection of something that I had to encounter the feeling of being dissatisfied with something that I knew was almost perfect, which is paradoxical. In other words, there was a door that suddenly appeared open in something that seemed to be a perfect shape that had no openings, no space for me. Photography, as Robert Frank had done, it just seems like it had no space for me. And like all young people, you're trying to find your place, which you can't define in advance. It just has to happen as you try and struggle with the kind of art you want to do. And the other aspect that helped shape my relation with photography at the beginning was not so much the tradition of painting that's been made so much of in the writing about my work, although that's important, but the movement against the traditions, that kind of emerged in the late 1950s and into the 60s. That is, all the antique art aspects of the art of the 60s that challenged all the traditional criteria of art. And I feel that that in my case, and in the case of others who are probably in a similar position as I am, we did not in any way assume a continuous tradition, either of photography or of painting or even of art. We underwent this and participated in this critique of the continuous tradition of art that we call conceptual art or post-conceptual art or other related terms. And I know that personally I took that very, very seriously, so seriously that I wasn't able to make anything as an artist for a number of years at the end of the 60s into the 70s. I simply didn't know what to do. I took very seriously the idea that maybe art as we know it was over and a new kind of art hadn't yet emerged, and that I would have to find a way to help invent that. I took that idea very seriously for a long time, and it was a very difficult and unsatisfying time. And through a long process, which I won't go into in detail, I found my way back to image making by the early middle 70s. And that's when I made some of the earliest pictures that you might have seen of mine, which are of course not in the show. But what happened was that I had a very powerful feeling at that time, let's say 1975, that any new image making that I could do, and I guess by extrapolation, any new image making that anybody would do that had any ambition, artistic ambition, and any artistic sophistication, could never emerge from a sense of continuing traditions, even though on the surface, especially in the 70s, the idea of making an image, a picture, and specifically a picture in the form of a tableau, which is one of the definitions we're giving for the work in this show, that to make such a thing at that time seemed to be precisely to defy all the critical ideas about art that had happened in the 70s, and to be attempting to restore a relationship to tradition that apparently had been disrupted definitively by all the things that happened, in that intervening time. But that was never my point of view. My view was there was no resumption of tradition, but paradoxically and interestingly, and it interested me, it seemed like pictorial art that that could relate back to what happened in the 20th, 19th, 17th, and even the 13th century, if you like. That pictorial art that could relate back to those models would emerge not from tradition, but from an anti-tradition. And that's where I saw the kind of door open for me. It was not going to be a resumption of photojournalism or reportage as art. It wasn't going to be a new spirit in painting, which was also the kind of other way of looking at what happened in the 70s, early 80s. That oil painting was going to, be resumed as if nothing had ever disturbed it. See, I didn't think that nothing had ever disturbed it. I thought what was interesting about image making, whether in painting or photography, was precisely that it had been so badly disturbed. And therefore what would appear would not be the same thing again. That it was not traditional. So I saw my pictures as emerging from a counter-tradition, almost an anti-pictorial tradition, but paradoxically becoming pictures again. Now that's pretty subtle, or that can become pretty subtle, and people could also not really buy this argument. I can understand that you might not buy it, and you might say, yes, that's a cool way of talking about it, but really he's just making pictures again like, going back to the 19th century, and I've been accused of that lots of times. But that's not how I see it. I think that even if you take it a step further back in time, once the first abstract paintings had been painted, like by Malevich or something, and the first really radical abstract paintings have been painted by, I guess, by Malevich or Levchenko, paintings that were really just monochromes, those paintings had been painted, and Mondrian played a part in this as well, of course, then on this blank surface that had now been invented as a painting, this black square, white square, if you like, any new image that would appear historically would be as if it was a figure traced out on an already existing monochrome. That could have never happened before this development of abstract art. So in other words, figurative art or pictorial art is not the same pictorial art after abstraction that it was before, even if it might resemble it in great detail. But weirdly enough, if you look at the pictorial art of the period after the beginning of abstraction, say from 1910, strangely enough, if you look at it, it doesn't resemble the art that went before. It just doesn't resemble. It doesn't look like art of 1920 doesn't look like art of 1860. It doesn't look like art of 1820. It doesn't look like art of 1720. They just don't look the same. Something happened, and the pictorial tradition, its whole status is completely transformed. So that's where I saw myself coming in. That's the entry. That was in a way my entry, and that entry was interestingly complicated. I'd say it was intellectually intriguing, technically exciting. I'll get to that in a second, as it opened up technical possibilities that maybe weren't explored before. And it seemed just gnarly and complicated and dialectical enough to be really fascinating, and having a lot of, it seemed to have potential to take art in directions that hadn't been before, or at least I felt I could take my own work in directions I couldn't take it before. And because I hadn't been able to do anything for a long time, this was even more intense for me, because I was really a totally failed artist, you know. I was completely a failure. I'd done a few very inferior conceptual artworks. I painted pretty mediocre paintings as a kid and even an adolescent. I didn't have the discipline to stick with that. You know, everything I did was conceptually wrong. I made a lot of mistakes. I frustrated myself, etc. So I was in the best place you can be in your early 20s, which is to be really messed up, completely messed up, and having every problem that you can possibly think of, and having no real good idea how to resolve it. And then, luckily, through various circumstances, seeing this little door, you know, this door beginning to open for you in an unexpected place. And I'll say I have one other component to this. One of the things I struggled to do as a young person, I thought this would work, you know. I was 23, whatever, 22. Because of all this, because of all the thinking about what had happened at that time, it seemed to me that art is finished, you know, and the only art form that was possible was the cinema. And this was the period of Jean-Luc Godard and Jacques Rivette and the early Fassbinder and the Nouvelle Vague, and a really wonderful moment in world cinema, when filmmakers, for various reasons, got to make very free, personal films on a very high artistic and technical level, very cheaply, because of the nature of the whole film economy at that time. This is really different from now, of course. But the model of Antonioni, of Bergman, Fassbinder, Bresson, Godard, in 1965 was enormously powerful, and it made it seem like cinema was the possibility for any ambitious young artist, not painting or sculpture. And I had a phase of that too in the 70s, and thought that, you know, I'd have to be a filmmaker, but I, of course, totally failed in that as well. But the experience, the intense experience of the cinema taught me a lot, because I learned to look at films like I would look at a Cézanne painting or Rembrandt painting. It was clear to me, even as a young person, that cinema, when it was practiced at a certain level, was an art form like painting, like poetry. like theater. Everyone knew that, and we know all these things, but it's one thing to know them, another to experience them yourself directly, immediately, and then have this judgment yourself. So I got very fascinated in the notion of how films were made, and that's where I began to think about the possibilities of cinematography as a kind of photography. Because really what happens in film is that a cameraman, they call them cameramen in film, we just call ourselves photographers. Let's call them a photographer. A photographer has a certain kind of camera and a certain set of problems to solve and a certain technical base and a certain number of collaborators to work with. Because films like Winter Light by Bergman or Mouchette by Bresson look so beautiful frame to frame, I realized that the people who photographed those films were photographers on a level with Cartier-Bresson or Bill Brandt or whoever was canonized in photography, that the cinematographers were making pictures as good as any other photographers. So at some point, all these things began to come together, partly because I had gotten back into an art studio in the 1970s after not having been in one for many years. And that was because I was teaching and had to have a studio to teach in. And once I got back into an art studio, many of these issues began to flow together, and I began to think about a kind of photography that I could make that would not be in black and white, that would not be photojournalistic, that would not be restricted in scale, that would involve aspects of cinematography, that would somehow express that changed relationship with traditional pictorial art, that would have a relationship with painting that was, I have to call it, a dialectical relation with painting, meaning it was not an identification, it was not carrying on of painting, it was not just a love of painting, it was not a new spirit of painting, it was not doing photography by means of painting, it was not doing any of those things that people thought we were doing, which was painting by means of photography, photography by means of painting, photographers who are really painters. He's really a painter. These are his paintings, not his photographs. None of that. It was clearly photography, but it was coming at a moment when all artists' relation with the traditions was being transformed. And so, then I began to make pictures that were larger, pictures that were in color, and so on, like what you see in the show. The issue of the transparency I'll touch on quickly. I got known for being the light box person, and when I was crossing the U.S. border recently, the customs guy Googled me and said, "You're the light box guy." That's the way. So I got to be the light box guy because I made light boxes for a long time. In the 70s, when I wanted to start making pictures on a larger scale, I didn't know anything about it, so I had to go to where they were being made, which is, of course, in the commercial area, the commercial photo labs. And I looked at my various options, which were pretty limited in 1974. And was not certain what to do. And the guy in the lab who I was working with saw that we made some tests of various kind of prints, and he said, "You know about this transparent material called cebachrome?" And I guess I knew it because everybody knew it because they saw it in an airport or something. I never thought about it. I said, "Why don't we try that?" And we did try it, and I liked it. And what I mostly liked about it was that it was very permanent. That material, which no longer exists, was at that time the most permanent color material available. So I was drawn to it because I've always wanted my pictures to last. The reason I want them to last is because I've gained so much in my life from old art. So if I'm an artist and I want to contribute something, I hope it can last so that others can have the kind of experience I had. Unfortunately, color photography is the least, lasting medium that we have. Another paradox. But I've always been looking for permanence. So I tried it because of that and liked it. And the other aspect that came up at that moment was, of course, it didn't look like photography at all. It didn't look like art photography at all. Art photography still looked like what Dion Arbus was doing, or what Lee Friedlander was doing, or maybe what what Douglas Hubler was doing, but it didn't look like that. And I knew that, you know, Clement Greenberg had said, all really good new art looks ugly at first. And I thought, this looks like that kind of ugliness. And of course, the minimalist artists like Judd and Carl Andre also had emphasized that new art often had the look of non-art. And that was a very big thing in the 60s and 70s, that what was new first looked kind of ugly, and secondly, it didn't look like art. And if it had those two characteristics, you might feel hopeful that what you were doing was actually something that wasn't already cut and dried. So I like the fact that it just didn't look like photography at all at that time. And so then I began to do the kind of pictures that you can see upstairs. So I began to call them cinematography because cinematography seemed to be the term that captured what I was trying to do. Collaborate with people when necessary, prepare things in advance to photograph when necessary. Basically, to me, cinematography boiled down to those two components. And those are the two things that someone like Robert Frank would never do. Never collaborated with anyone. He's a lone wolf, hunter, capturing people unaware, and preparing nothing except himself, and making what we know. This was the opposite, and it led to a different kind of photography. What it also did, for me at least, was to open up the idea that although reportage is probably the central and perfect version of photography, it lacks the virtue of being the totality of photography. It may be the main type of photography, but it isn't all of what photography is. Photography as a medium is just too complex to be encompassed by one mode. Even a mode as significant as that one. So it seemed also that all these aspects that this sort of fusion of painting, cinema, etc., opened up were also equally close to the essence of the medium of photography as well. They weren't less photographic, even though they've been accused of it many times. So it seemed to me that what's called stagecraft for the moment, artifice, color, etc., all those things were inherent in the photographic medium. I could go on about this at length, but I won't, to suggest that artifice in photography was at the origin of photography. That not only was the spontaneous generation of a real image at the very beginning, but some form of artifice was also there. They were both present in the beginning or in the origin of the medium. So it seemed to me that I was also able to stay very close to the medium of photography whilst making images that didn't appear at first glance to be like what essential photographs essentially were to be. So that afforded me a certain kind of freedom that I noticed I felt I wouldn't have if I had followed along the line of, say, like I say, if I followed Robert Frank's path, which many people were doing in the middle of the 70s, and are still doing. I had the freedom to begin a photograph. Every photograph is indebted to its subject in a way that a watercolor is not necessarily, an oil painting is not necessarily, a sculpture is not necessarily. Photograph is indebted to its subject because it has to record that subject mechanically somehow, under some conditions. So we're dependent on the subject. And people's reactions to photographs are much more dependent on the subject than they are in the other arts as well. But I felt that using this notion, it meant that I could engage in reportage if I wanted. I could also engage in something completely artificial if I wanted. And that either, let's call those two poles, that either of those poles would be equally viable starting points, and moreover they would be equally viable as photographic, as instances of the medium of photography. So that allowed me to avoid what I thought of as mental traps of creating oppositions between, say, fact, which is so-called documentary photography, and fiction, which is like Cindy Sherman type photography, you know. So you have these two poles, fact and fiction, and there's two different kinds of photography, you know, between reportage and subjectivity. It avoided any kind of binary relations between these apparent values. And that meant that inside, I might start, let's say, from a completely imaginary starting point, like you see in the picture upstairs, the flooded grave, which is from a later time, but represents something similar to things I'd done much earlier. The flooded grave began as, there you go, flooded grave began as a kind of a daydream that occurred, I don't really know how. And the daydream aspect was simply, and I think I was walking in the rain, and I don't think I was walking in the cemetery. My memory's failing me here, but I'll give you the gist of it. At some point I had some sort of daydream which gave me this notion that a pool of water would suddenly appear to me as if it was an undersea reality. I don't even know if it was a grave, I can't remember. But eventually it became one because maybe that seemed more intense. So the starting point was nothing. It was just a vagrant, you know, just a little vagrant thought that I picked up on and remembered. So the picture has a totally imaginary origin. But everything you see in that picture is a documentary photograph. And there are about 100 of them in there, because it's a digital montage. But they're simply, it's a montage of facts. Everything you see is there, including the undersea light, which you can't see in the projection here, but you can certainly see upstairs. You know, the undersea world was constructed very laboriously in my studio and all that stuff. Real animals were put in there, and as you know, animals, well, sea animals, they don't perform. There are no performances taking place here. If you see a fish swimming, it's because the fish was swimming. If you see an octopus stretching out its limbs, because it was stretching out its limbs. There are no performances. There is no fiction. It's all documentary photography, see? They're all documentary photographs, but they're montaged into something else, you know, in terms of a plan. So what I think is fascinating me about that, and this is in principle operating in most of my pictures, is there is no real dividing line between reportage and studio photography, no dividing line between reportage and you know, fiction, so-called fictional photography. In the medium of photography, especially one can indulge in montage, but not only in montages. There's no absolute dividing line, and this is inherent in the nature of photography. So let's take the word stage photography just for a second. I've always hated that term because stage photography suggests that what you're seeing has been photographed on a stage, as in a theater, because stage means staged in a theater. Now, if I was standing in the street with my phone and I was taking pictures of people passing by, I would be like Robert Frank. I would be doing a reportage. And if, while I was standing there with my phone, and I pointed at someone as they passed by and caught their attention, and they pointed back at me, and I photographed them, that would be stage photography already. Because I collaborated with that person, and he performed or she performed with me. It's already cinematography. The line is infinitely thin between these two types, so-called two different types of photography. So what was liberating for me was the idea that aspects of both can be present not only in a single picture, but in the process of making a picture. Let me see if I can give you another example. Volunteer, which is a very different kind of picture, which is here to show. Which is one of my first black and white photos made in '96. It's on the first floor, I think. You'll see in just a second. This is an example of something I also call sometimes near documentary. And I know that sometimes these terms are confusing, so I'll just tell you how I use them. I have three terms that I've used, and I've used them for clarification, and they've almost always ended up creating confusion. One is cinematography, which I think I've explained. The other is documentary photography, which I think explains itself. What I mean by documentary photography is what everybody means by documentary photography. And they're two different things, so I can distinguish them. If you look at a picture, like let's say one of the city scenes that I have upstairs, like Dawn, for example, we put that on for 71. It's a documentary photograph, meaning it's just, I just went to a place and I photographed it as you see it. That's a documentary photograph. You know, I like to think that just a picture of the world, with or without people, can become a composition that is satisfying in for itself, and so it can become a tableau, just in the way that a picture that has an event in it. So I make documentary photographs rather continuously. I make quite a few. There's several in the show. I'll go back to the other one. I also use the term near documentary sometimes for pictures that I think look or contemplate the look of documentary photography, but are not themselves, strictly speaking, documentary photographs. These are cinematographic photographs. These are cinematography because I've collaborated and I've prepared. So Volunteer, which was made in the mid-90s, was a picture I wanted to make because of something I've witnessed myself. That is somebody working in a place like this, cleaning up at the end of the day or the evening. And I should also just say at this moment as an aside that most of the subjects, or all of the subjects in the show, in my work and in the show, most if not all the subjects emerge from things I've witnessed myself and not photographed. And I've said many times that I begin my work by not photographing something, by letting something happen without photographing it in a conventional way, but then working in the space that I created by, in a way, declining the opportunity to photograph something directly. That's not just to not photograph. You see, that's to create a new space, the space that comes after the not having photographed. That's the space I work in, the space after not having photographed something. Because I'm going to photograph it again. It's just that it's disappeared already and can't be photographed anymore. So when I saw the original person mopping, I didn't photograph him. Therefore, he escaped. That photograph never took place. Another space opened up, which is the space inside of the not having photographed. That's the space I work in. I'm photographing the man who never appeared in the photograph. Therefore, this is a different image. So there's a reconstruction. That's a separate point. The point I originally was going to make was that this picture is both documentary and not. And this is something that I think is both important, since we're having a talk here, and unimportant, since I think it's important to experience pictures and not worry too much about how they got made. But since we're talking about it, I'll say this just to make my point. I hired this man to come and mop this floor. And I hired him for a month because I did not want him to be some actor pretending to mop a floor. I gave him a job. He needed a job. I gave him a job, which was to come every day and mop this floor. And I would be there with my camera waiting for him. My camera would always be in the same place. I would always be in the same place. My approach in this case, and I've used it in other pictures, is said hello, he got his mop, he knew what to do, didn't talk, no directions, no do this, no do that, nothing. He mops for 20 minutes. I photograph him as many times as I can photograph in the 20 minutes. That's the end of the thing. Every day he comes, we do it. After a certain number of days, I don't remember, I got this particular shot, which I like very much. There's a lot of reasons why, I won't go into it, why I think it's better than the other ones. It's not a real place in the sense that what you think it's being used for, it may not be. Just some invention of the place. It's a copy of a real place, which I had no access to. So it's not a real place, but there is a real place that looks almost exactly like that. The floor was dirty because we made it dirty every day. So he came and he mocked, and of course he thought he was posing for a picture, and that's what he began by thinking. He was posing for a picture, but slowly as the work went on, he realized he was just there to mock, and so he mocked, and I photographed him, and that was it. That's what happened. So is that not happening? Is it actual? Is it inactual? I think that if you see it that way, you realize it's undecidable. And from another slightly different side, it doesn't matter. All photographs record something that's happening in front of the camera. It makes no difference whether he's in a real drop-in center mopping, or whether he's in my reconstructed drop-in center mopping. You're seeing a man mop. Whatever you see happening is happening. There is no fiction in that sense. There's something that occurs photographically. Now, I know that's partly absurd, and of course there is a difference between a picture taken in a real drop-in center and mine, but I account for that difference by saying that this is an example of what I would call near documentary. It's contemplation of my relationship to documentary photography. Because I admire documentary photography, like I said, I'm interested in it. But I don't really want to practice it directly. But I'm continually contemplating and thinking about it. These kind of photographs are my contemplation of what documentary photography is like, how it feels, what it means, and all that sort of thing. And I think that's a kind of continuous strain in what I do. And if you see the exhibition, I think you'll see a lot of pictures that you could call near documentary. So there are different threads, in my work. There's the kind of thing that derives from an imaginary thing, which is then enwrapped in fact in some way. There's an aspect of stuff that begins with fact, that's enwrapped in production in some way. That begins with an actuality that gets tied up with artifice in some way, and the things play between themselves in different registers. And I find it enjoyable to keep trying to work differently with those registers, moving in different directions depending on different techniques and so on. And of course, the other aspect of it is the fact that pictorial form as an entity, as an art form, is infinitely open. I think one of the reasons why pictorial art does have a long tradition, going back at least a millennium now, is that there's always another picture to make. There's always something happening that hasn't happened quite that way before, or quite that place in that light. And above all, it hasn't been seen by that person. In this case, me, but in any case, someone else. There's obviously now two kinds of art. There's the kind of art that came after abstraction and after conceptualism, which has not much to do with these pictorial values anymore. And that's a very important kind of art that exists today. And then there is pictorial art, which in a way now only exists in the shadow of this post-conceptual redefinition of art, and therefore is not strictly traditional. But while it's not traditional, it is this kind of open funnel of picturing that really does go back into the past without having any pastness to it. That for me, when I see an old work of art, no matter how old it is, if I'm enjoying it and I'm having some kind of intense aesthetic experience in front of it, it's happening now. So to me, all good art is always new, it's always happening now. There is no really, in that sense, there is no old art. There may be old experiences of it, or maybe an old object, but the artistic experience is always in the now. So the other kind of joy of picture making is the fact that you know that at any moment around the corner, another starting point will happen. I know I'm going to stop in a second, so we have a little bit of time if there are any questions. I'll just say that because photography is so dependent on the subject, we are all photographers, we're always sort of hunters. You know, Cartier-Bresson is a great example of this lightning quick little hunting machine who could jump around and move through the world quickly and invisibly to capture things. You know, that is the essence of the hunter photographer. You know, compared to Cartier-Bresson, I'm the kind of person who goes everywhere in a battleship or something, very slowly and will move quickly and carry a lot of stuff with me. But I'm a hunter just the same as him. All photographers are hunters, or waiters, if you want to think of it that way. For example, the octopus. The octopus is a carnivore, but it doesn't run around out in the ocean because it's vulnerable. It has no skeleton, and it's easily eaten by a tuna or a fish. So what the octopus does is it waits in a little corner, curled up into a very small shape, and waits till a crustacean or something comes by, and it darts out and catches it. It's a hunter too, even though it doesn't move very much. So in a way, hunters are also waiters. They can also stay places out and wait for something to happen. Everybody who photographs is hunting, hoping for that next moment. What the moment is, what the event is, and all the events you can see and photographed in my pictures are circumstances where some real thing happened, like a person mopping the floor, or a guy siphoning some gasoline from a car, or whatever it happened to be, that interested me in for themselves, but above all, disclosed the possibility of some sort of picture that I didn't know I wanted to make until I'd seen that thing. Because that thing also was a formal, had something formal about it in relation to color, shape, figure, this and that disclosed some kind of relationship I hadn't thought about in terms of the rectangle that the picture has to be. And that to me is the artistry, or the core of the artistry of photography for me, which is still the idea that there is a something, whether it's an occurrence or even the absence of an occurrence, that is an empty place with nothing apparently happening, which somehow tells you or suggests to you the presence of a picture that hasn't yet been seen, even though we now have thousands, maybe even millions of wonderful pictures that seem to, cover every aspect of imaginable existence. But the fact is, and this is just to reiterate, that the pictorial form is always future-oriented. It's always there waiting for the next incident to disclose something that can happen next.